Hello and welcome back to our series on the Psalms. This week we are going to talk about the Psalms of Ascents. And unlike the other types of Psalms that we are looking at in this series, this is actually just a specific set of Psalms. So there's actually a section of the Psalms that is going to basically laid out as the Psalms of Ascents. We're talking Psalms 120 through 134. So a total of 15 psalms. A psalm of ascents, and by the way, we call them that because that's the inscription that has come down to us, a song of ascents. But a psalm of ascents is a psalm that if you were an Israelite, you would sing on your way up to the temple, because you are heading to Jerusalem for one of the feasts of obligation, most likely, or to offer some other sort of sacrifice. And these are the kinds of psalms that you would sing along the way. They're called psalms of ascents because you are ascending to Jerusalem and to the Temple Mount. All right, and you've probably seen this kind of language throughout the scriptures, this kind of up and down language to and from Jerusalem. You see it a lot in Acts, for example. Luke talks about people going down from Jerusalem to Samaria, to Gaza, to Egypt, to Caesarea, to Antioch. And all of this language of up and down is meant to signify the height at which Jerusalem sits, and specifically the height of the Temple Mount. So whenever you're going to Jerusalem, you are going up to Jerusalem. And when you're going away from Jerusalem, you are going down from Jerusalem. And so these psalms of ascents are meant to signify you are on your way to go worship. The whole point of these psalms is that you're celebrating the fact that you are on your way up to worship the Lord. So the Psalms of Ascents then introduce us to a practice that we don't really talk much about in the churches. It's something that we might call pre-worship. Like, what do you do before you get to the worship assembly, as you're on your way to the worship assembly? Because in our circles, we talk a lot about the worship assembly itself, and rightly so. Because the worship assembly is, it's the center of our worship. I consider that to be one of the positive contributions that the churches of Christ have had on the faith, is our focus on the worship assembly. Because God has ordained the worship assembly. He has instructed us through the apostles how we are to conduct the worship assembly. And he has instructed us how we ought to conduct ourselves during the worship assembly. We also, in the New Testament, get a fairly broad picture of how we are to conduct ourselves out in the world, outside the worship assembly. The Psalms of Ascents suggest that we don't just flip a switch, as it were, when we arrive at the worship assembly, or, for that matter, when we depart from the worship assembly. Instead, the Psalms of Ascents show us this gradual transition from life out in the world to the life that is present in the worship assembly. That it's something that you've kind of got to ease yourself into, that you actually have to prepare yourself in some way for appearing before the Lord in the worship assembly. Now, this is a message that I think we always need to hear, right? That we always need to keep it in mind, that it's not just some switch that we flip whenever we arrive at the worship assembly, that it's something, again, we are preparing ourselves for and transitioning into. That's important to hear all the time, but I think it's especially important to hear now, in the midst of quarantines and lockdowns and just the whole current unpleasantness, because we're in a pretty unique time in history when e-worship, if we can call it that, at home has become fairly common. And it's common for this type of worship, well, I don't know that I necessarily want to say that, because it's so new that I think a lot of us are just kind of trying to figure things out as we go along. We're trying to adapt to the situation as it's being presented to us. And just like there is a temptation, like we talked about a few weeks ago, to sit down and treat the printed Bible the same way that you would treat a novel or a newspaper, just because of the medium that is presented in, there's a similar risk to treating, worship from home, e-worship in particular, video worship, as we would treat any kind of screen viewing. Whether we're talking, watching a TV show or playing a computer game or browsing on the internet or just goofing off on our phones on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, there's, I think, a pretty big risk for us, if we're not mindful about what we're doing, to approach worship over the screen in the same way that we would approach anything else over the screen. And we really need to tread carefully in how we approach this type of worship. We also need to tread carefully in what we say about this type of worship and what kind of judgments we render. For example, it's not a problem per se for people to engage in this kind of screen mediated worship. I don't know what even to call it. E-worship is probably the best word for it, but it's also kind of a dumb word if you pardon my being frank there. Let's just call it e-worship for the sake of having an easy word. It's not a problem per se for people to engage in e-worship wearing their pajamas. Right now, maybe you at home, feel more comfortable, actually dressing up as if you were going to church, and that can be a useful, preparation. It can be a useful thing. The point, though, is that what's going on outwardly is less of an issue than what's going on inwardly. Now, of course, outward things can lead to inward things. It may be that if you dress in your pajamas, your heart's in pajamas, if you take my meaning. Of course, I think for most of us, it's probably not a problem. If we prepare our hearts well, what you've got on the outside of your body, again, that's not really the big thing, because the scriptures call our attention to the heart, the way that we are approaching worship from the heart. And so that's what we want to do as we are conducting ourselves in worship, and as we're figuring out this new type of worship that we're having to engage in temporarily. We want to consider what's going on in the heart and ask ourselves, are we approaching worship with a worshipful heart? Are we approaching e-worship the same way that we would in-person worship in the worship assembly? And by this is why in-person worship is so essential. Right? Like, e-worship is never ever going to replace, at least it should never replace, in-person worship on any kind of permanent basis, because there's just really no comparison. But so long as we're in a circumstance that calls for this kind of distanced worship, where many of us are having to stay at home because of the circumstances, we have to navigate this heart issue. Are we approaching e-worship the same way that we would in-person worship, reverentially? And that's where the Psalms of Ascents are indispensable, because they are there to prepare the heart. And this should make a kind of intuitive sense to us, by the way, because it's common, at least in the order of worship for churches of Christ, for us to sing a song before we partake of the Lord's Supper. And it's one of the stock phrases that you can hear at I think, almost any Church of Christ that you visit in the United States. What does the song leader always say whenever they announce the Lord's Supper song? Why are we singing that song? To prepare our hearts to partake of the Lord's Supper. All right, the idea is that you use this song to, again, take the time to align your heart properly. Get into the proper headspace, as it were, for partaking of the Lord's Supper. The Psalms of Ascents are that, but instead of being geared specifically towards the Lord's Supper, they are geared towards worship in general. They are there to prepare our hearts for worship. So let's turn our attention to the first of the Psalms of Ascents, Psalm 120, and we'll use it to kick off our study today. In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. Deliver me, O Lord, from lying lips, from a deceitful tongue. What shall be given to you, and what more shall be done to you, you deceitful tongue? A warrior's sharp arrows with glowing coals of the broom tree. Woe to me that I sojourn in Meshech, that I dwell among the tents of Kedar. Too long have I had my dwelling among those who hate peace. I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war. All right, now bear in mind that the inscription on this calls it a Song of Ascents. And this is our introduction to the Psalms of Ascents. It starts, even though it doesn't necessarily sound like, this is the kind of thing that I would sing on my way to church, or on my way to the worship assembly. In Israel's case, on the way up to the temple. This is the way that the Psalter, inspired by the Spirit, chooses to introduce this whole section of the Psalms, is with this one. And it starts with a song of thanksgiving, a song of praise, which we're familiar with from last week. As the psalmist is traveling up to Jerusalem, he remembers the salvation that has come down from Jerusalem, because the psalmist has been the victim of lying and scheming, but the Lord has saved him from it. And that leads the psalmist to, again, first off, give thanks for what the Lord has done, but then meditating on what the Lord has had to save him from leads the psalmist into a lament, because he's dealing with these things. The Lord has had to save him from these things, mainly because of where the psalmist has to live. Is woe to me that I sojourn in Meshech, that I dwell among the tents of Kedar. Too long have I had my dwelling among those who hate peace. There are a couple of ways that we can take this reference to Meshech and Kedar, both of which basically have to be figurative. It's not possible for the psalmist to live at the same time in Meshech and Kedar, because they're in completely opposite directions from each other relative to Israel. They're basically on opposite sides of Israel, as far as I understand it. What they're meant to bring to mind as a metaphor is distance from the Lord's house. Again, the psalmist is saying that he lives outside of Israel, and pretty far outside of Israel. He's not close to the temple at all. He doesn't have regular access to the temple and regular access to Jerusalem. The Feasts of Obligation are probably the only times that he gets to see the temple. So we're talking 3 times a year. And, we felt like we were put upon, whenever we had to forego the physical worship assembly for, I don't remember how long we were out, if it was 1 month, 2 months. But think about that. Imagine only getting to go to the worship assembly 3 times a year, and the rest of the time you just live among rotten people who are constantly just lying and scheming and trying to bring you down. This metaphor, Meshech and Kedar, also, because of that, suggests the great wickedness of the psalmist's neighbors. They are, he lives among the nations. He doesn't live among Israel. Now, as we know from the record of Israel's history that Israel's no peach, as it were. Israel can be just as rotten as everybody else, and we've got plenty of examples of when they're even more rotten. But in the psalmist's experience, he's in a worse situation by being outside of Israel than he would be living inside of Israel. He's constantly surrounded by wicked people trying to bring him down. And because of that, he longs for the sanctuary of God's house. He longs for this place where he will be closer to God and safe from the wickedness of the world. And so all of these things are running through the psalmist's head as he is ascending up to Jerusalem, heading towards the Temple Mount to worship God. There's a lot of stuff to be running through. and this longing for a home with God and a lament about the place where the psalmist lives outside of Israel. So again, there's thanksgiving, there's lament, there's all kinds of things packed into this psalm, preparing the psalmist to arrive in Jerusalem and participate in the feast and offer his sacrifices. Now, this gives us some suggestions, by the way, for things that we can be thinking about, ways that we can be aligning our hearts as we prepare to go to worship on Sunday mornings. Because we should sympathize with the psalmists, because we live in the world. We long for a home with God where there's no wickedness. Whether we're talking our own wickedness or the wickedness of our neighbors. Right? Let's not pretend like we want to be humble and we want to confess our own wickedness, but at the same time we also want to recognize that the world is a dark place. And the world is full of sin. As we read in many other places, the world is run by demons. Right? We're stuck out in that throughout the week. And every week, at least once a week, we get to go into the sanctuary of the worship assembly. I'm not talking about the building, right? I don't mean to be, picayune about any of this, but it's not misunderstood. The worship assembly itself is a sanctuary, at least it ought to be. And we also ought to sympathize with this idea that we are far from home, or that we're longing for that home. This should get us thinking not only about the worship assembly, but what the worship assembly foreshadows, our eternal home with the Lord in heaven. So all of these things, should be going through our minds. And these are things that, again, that we can be thinking about as we prepare ourselves, as we're traveling to the worship assembly from home. These are things that we can be doing instead of, whatever it is we normally do, just listening to the radio or just not doing anything or thinking about what you're going to have for lunch. That's the big one that I'm guilty of. So these are ways that we can align our hearts. So let's turn our attention to singing Psalm 120. And I actually, I'm going to put myself out there a little bit. I couldn't find a metrical adaptation of Psalm 120 that I liked, so I decided to try my hand at writing one. So this is it's a work in progress, but I think it's good enough for show right now, good enough for use. I have adapted Psalm 120 into 3 verses in the common meter. Let's just read through it together before we sing. In my distress I cried to God. He heard and answered me. Deliver me from lying tongues, from slander and deceit. Verse 2. What shall he give to you, O tongue, and what more shall he do? The Lord whets arrows for your lies and readies coals for you. Verse 3. Alas for me, my dwelling place so distant from his door. Too long I've dwelt in restless lands where people lust for war. All right, so pretty short and simple. Because it's a common meter hymn, we can sing it to just about anything. I figured today, because one of the things that we want to get used to, if we are trying to condition ourselves to be a singing people that is used to singing, particularly singing the scriptures, just in our own free time, is we don't necessarily want to be shackled to the sheet music all the time. It's great if you know how to read music. It's very, very useful to know how to read music. But instead of reaching for a tune that is that's in our songbook, today we're going to look at some different tunes that maybe you're not familiar with. A couple of them, from what I understand, are fairly common outside of the Churches of Christ. But it'll be like, you get to learn a new tune as well. And that's part of the process of getting things stuck in your head. If you're learning the music and the music kind of gets stuck in your head, it's easier for the words to get stuck there too. So what we're going to sing this adaptation of Psalm 120 to is a tune called Morning Song. And you normally hear it used for The King Shall Come When Morning Dawns. That hymn is in Psalms, Hymns, and Spiritual Songs, but it is set to a different tune. So we're going to use Morning Song. All right, let's sing. In my distress I cried to God. He heard and answered me. Deliver me from lying tongues, from slander and deceit. What shall he give to you, O tongue, and what more shall he do? The Lord whets arrows for your lies, and readies coals for you. Alas for me, my dwelling place, so distant from his store. Too long I've dwelt in restless lands, where people lust for war. All right, so pretty short and simple. Probably fairly easy to memorize. And the tune is fairly easy to sing and fairly easy to memorize as well. So that's the first Psalm of Ascents. Not all of the Psalms of Ascents, though, have that same mix of longing and lament as you're traveling up to the temple. A lot of the Psalms of Ascents are full of joy and excitement. And that's the way that the next song we're going to look at is. It approaches the ascent with just gladness and excitement. I am on my way to go worship the Lord. So let's turn to Psalm 122 together. I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord." Our feet have been standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem, built as a city that is bound firmly together, to which the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, as was decreed for Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. Their thrones for judgment were set, the thrones of the house of David. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they be secure who love you. Peace be within your walls, and security within your towers. For my brothers' and companions' sake, I will say, peace be within you. For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek your good. All right, so you can see this psalm maintains a much more upbeat outlook, and it finishes on a much more upbeat tone. All right, Psalm 120 it almost kind of leaves you hanging. The last thing that you read about is that the psalmist lives in this place where he may be for peace, but everyone else there is for war. And there's no resolution to that. Right? The resolution is what's expected to come later, right? A home in the sanctuary. And so it's kind of left hanging out there as almost as a request, right? Lord, bring me home, right? Don't leave me hanging out among the nations all this time. Psalm 122, though, you could resolve it at practically any place. There's not really any kind of tension in the psalm. It ends with this. It ends looking forward, asking for peace for Jerusalem and for the temple. Excuse me. It celebrates Jerusalem as a place of worship, and the place where righteous judgments are rendered for the people. You notice the psalmist talks about the thrones of the house of David being set up, judgment thrones being set up, so that the house of David can render judgment for the people, because that's part of the king's job, and that's part of what happens whenever everybody comes to the Feast of Obligation. If they have any outstanding cases, anything that needs to be rectified, they bring their case before the king. And the psalmist expresses it like it's guaranteed, right? You're going to get justice from the house of David. All right, so it's very idealized. And that's part of what the psalm teaches us. It is absolutely fine to idealize the dwelling place of God in this way. You can go back through the history of Israel and find all kinds of examples where the kings of Israel, and particularly those of the house of David, and even David himself, or we find time and again, they don't render righteous judgment. You could see it with David in all kinds of cases. In fact, in our Law of Moses class today, we're going to be looking at one of those cases where David fails to render proper judgment. And yet the psalmist can present this trip to Jerusalem as, look, when we get there, we're going to get justice from the house of David. So again, it is absolutely appropriate to idealize the house of God in that way, and to idealize the servants of God, within that limited context. There's value to, at least in a narrow context, idealizing the church, idealizing our brothers and sisters in Christ, idealizing, in a congregation that's got elders, idealizing the eldership, right? Not that that's the only thing. Right, not that your idealized view of the congregation is your only view of the congregation. It's just that it is appropriate in, to some limited degree, to have that kind of view, because the psalmist could have pretty easily spent his whole time ragging out the house of David, but he doesn't. He's celebrating it, because he is celebrating it as a gift from God. He is celebrating it as it ought to be, and we can celebrate the church as it ought to be. And because the psalmist celebrates the house of David in this way, and the temple, and the whole city of Jerusalem where all of this is contained, he prays for the security and the peace, the well-being of Jerusalem. Peace be within your walls and security within your towers. And so all of this is entirely appropriate for us to pray and to think about the church. Right? It's a place of worship. It ought to be a place of justice. And just as with Jerusalem, again, it is entirely appropriate to pray for the peace and security of the church. It's not comfort-seeking to do so. Right? There's definitely a sense in which we can engage in comfort seeking, but praying for peace and well-being is not it. Right? God doesn't, at least the example that we're given here is not, our faith needs to be stronger, so God, come and sack Jerusalem. Come burn the church house down to increase our faith. It's not the picture that we're given here. We are given that kind of picture elsewhere in the scriptures. That is something that we ought to hold in mind. But in this context, particularly as you are approaching worship, it is appropriate to wish for peace and security and well-being for the church. I think perhaps the main thrust for us is that the thought of going to the worship assembly ought to fill us with joy. Right, that's the first line. I was glad when they said, let us go up to the house of God. The worship assembly is something we ought to be looking forward to. And so let's look at Psalm 122, adapted to English meter. And we'll learn how to sing this. This song in particular, I think this is probably going to be one that I personally use quite a bit. This is a very good adaptation written by Esther Arnold. And again, there's just a lot of great sentiment in this psalm. So let's have a look at it. It's in 3 verses. It is written in common meter double. So the first verse: My heart was glad, my soul rejoiced when they said unto me, Let us go to the house of God and enter joyfully. Our feet are standing in your gates, Jerusalem, my joy, a city strongly built together, joined in unity. Verse 2: Here Israel's tribes come up to praise and bless Jehovah's name. At his decree they yearly come to worship him again. In Zion's city judgment thrones are set for Israel's king, and righteous rule for all who come the house of David brings. Verse 3: For Israel's peace I pray to God, Jerusalem be blessed. May all who love you prosper well and live in joyfulness. Shalom lodge here within your walls, your palaces be graced. For you, my brothers and my friends, for God's house I seek peace. All right, so common meter double. We've got several tunes in our hymnal that are set to common meter double. Really only a couple that I'm familiar with. Esther Arnold, I believe, chose to set this to a tune that we don't have in our hymnals called Halifax. And that tune was written by George Friedrich Handel. Beautiful tune, and once you go through that tune a couple of times, it will really get stuck in your head. It's the perfect tune to set scripture to, because it really will just burrow its way into your brain. So let's go back to the beginning of verse 1 here and have a look. We'll have a sing through Psalm 122. Let's see. Let me make sure I can get the pitch. Oh, you know what? So you've probably noticed throughout this, I have not been mechanically pitching these songs. Again, for the same reason that today I'm choosing to use some tunes that are not in our hymnals. Because again, we need to get used to just singing. It takes a little bit of playing around, a little bit of experimentation. You just kind of figure out what your comfortable vocal range is, and you just kind of pitch things appropriately. So it can lead to some trial and error, and we'll see if this trial leads to some error on my part. But let's give it a try. Psalm 122. My heart was glad, my soul rejoiced when they said unto me, Let us go to the house of God and enter joyfully. Our feet are standing in your gates, Jerusalem, my joy. A city strongly built together, joined in unity. Here Israel's tribes come up to praise and bless Jehovah's name. At his decree they yearly come to worship him again. In Zion city judgment thrones are set for Israel's king, and righteous rule for all who come the house of David brings. For Israel's peace I pray to God, Jerusalem be blessed. May all who love you prosper well and live in joyfulness. Shalom lodge here within your walls, your palaces be graced. For you, my brothers and my friends, for God's house I seek peace. All right, beautiful adaptation, beautiful tune. That is one that I'm going to make sure to get stuck in my head. And in speaking of that, by the way, um, I am proof positive that you can, with just minimal application, get these scriptures stuck in your head. I have got the worst memory of like anybody that I know. Um, I'm not going to throw my own mother under the bus. Her memory's worse than mine, but my memory is absolutely terrible. And with minimal effort, minimal application on this, um, I've been able to, well, like Psalm 1 that we went over a couple of weeks ago. It is, I think I've finally gotten to the point with it where it's just there. And it'll just kind of spontaneously bubble up to the surface, whenever I'm out like walking around or whatever. That's the sort of thing that you want. That's the sort of thing that you want to have happen. Get it in your head well enough that it just kind of spontaneously comes out. That's a good place to be. So I'll personally at least be trying to do that with Psalm 122. The last psalm that we're going to look at today is Psalm 133. So it is close to the end of the Psalms of Ascents. And the whole focus of Psalm 133 is the fellowship of the worship assembly. So let's read Psalm 133 together. Behold, how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity. It is like the precious oil on the head running down on the beard of Aaron, running down on the collar of his robes. It is like the dew of Hermon which falls on the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord has commanded the blessing, life forevermore. All right, this is just about as simple as a psalm gets. I think it's only 3 verses long. And it's a celebration of fellowship. This is something that we really ought to get in our hearts, this celebration of the fellowship that we share in the Lord's church. Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. And I love the metaphors that the psalmist uses here in Psalm 133. It's like the precious oil running down on the head, running down on the beard of Aaron. So it's like the consecration oil, right? This fellowship is the fellowship of the church consecrates us in some fashion. Obviously not like baptism or the Lord's Supper, but it's part of God's plan in this way. It is a special grace that He has given us. It is a sign of our calling, as it were, just as the oil of consecration is a sign of Aaron's calling as high priest. It's a reminder that we are to be a nation of priests. As the Lord said to Israel, and as Peter quotes in talking to us about our role in the church, what the church is supposed to be. We are a nation of priests. And so I find that this metaphor, this image of fellowship being like the oil that's poured on Aaron's head and that runs down on his beard and down on his holy garments, I find that to be a really apt metaphor for the fellowship that we share in the worship assembly and the church. Like the dew of Hermon, which falls on the mountains of Zion. It's refreshing. It's a source of life. Because the Lord has commanded the blessing from the mountains of Zion. Life forevermore. And that's the blessing that we have in the church. Again, it's such a simple, short psalm, and yet so profound, so meaningful. And I love the way that Psalm 133, it's kind of bringing things to a close, right? It's not the last of the Psalms of Ascent. But remember, the Psalms of Ascent open in Psalm 120 with this desire that is not often enough fulfilled for the psalmist to be near God, to be in the presence of God. There's this lament at how far away he lives from the house of God and among these lying and deceitful neighbors. The house of God offers a reprieve from that. And Psalm 133 echoes that desire. It's the positive outcome of that desire. You get to be in God's house, and you get to be among decent people. At least it's supposed to be, right? It's also a call to us to make sure that we live up to this idealized form of God's holy people. Because it's supposed to be, brothers and sisters in the Lord are supposed to dwell together in unity. It's supposed to be refreshing to have this kind of fellowship. The worship assembly is not supposed to be a place where people dread to set foot. And sadly, there are congregations that are like that are fractured, and in the process of fracturing to a point where members of the congregation dread coming to the worship assembly. And if that's the case, we've got things entirely backwards. Psalm 133 is a good way to get our priorities in order when it comes to the unity of the church in the worship assembly. We're supposed to anticipate fellowship every time we assemble to worship. And we do that because we're anticipating a greater communion, a greater fellowship that the worship assembly foreshadows. The final communion that we share with all of the saints, with our Lord in heaven. The worship assembly is supposed to be like a microcosm of that. It's a peek behind the curtain, as it were. The Hebrew writer presents it that way, that in Jesus Christ we have essentially gotten to go behind the veil, or behind the curtain. We are, we're standing in the holy place, or in the Holy of Holies, as it were, because of what Jesus has done. Psalm 133 reminds us that the worship assembly is supposed to be that way. And singing something like Psalm 133 on your way to church, on your way to the worship assembly, is a good way to put yourself in that headspace. Remind you of what the worship assembly is supposed to be about. So, let's sing an adaptation of Psalm 133. This one's a little different. It's an adaptation that comes out of, I meant to have it on my desk here. It comes out of Cantica Sanctorum, and it was written by David Erb. It is, it's not set to any sort of common meter. It's, like we learned a few weeks ago, it's what the metrical psalms would refer to, or what the metrical psalter would refer to as a peculiar meter. So the tune that is written for this one is the only tune that I know to sing it to. And it's a nice tune. David Erb has done an excellent job adapting the psalm and writing music to set it to. Let's look at his adaptation first. Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. It is like the precious oil upon the head, running down on the beard of Aaron, running down on the edge of his garments. It is like the dew of Hermon descending upon the mountains of Zion, for there the Lord commanded the blessing, life forevermore. It's, as you can see, it's hardly even an adaptation. Right? He's moved a few things around, added a couple of phrases here or there just to generate some meter. But most of this has been writing music to fit the psalm. And so if you memorize this song, you've got Psalm 133 memorized, almost word for word. This is one, and again, this is just more proof that this method works. I picked up this book, Cantica Sanctorum, years ago. Oh, it's probably been at least... I can't remember how many years it's been off the top of my head. And this was one of the first songs that I taught myself out of it. And it's just been there in my head ever since. So if it can get stuck in my head, it can get stuck in your head too. Excellent, excellent psalm to have stuck in your head. So let us sing it together. Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. It is like the precious oil upon the head running down on the beard of Aaron, running down on the edge of his garments. It is like the dew of Hermon descending upon the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord commanded the blessing, life forevermore. Again, David Erb did an excellent job adapting that and setting it to music. It's, again, even though it's kind of a freewheeling tune, not, it doesn't fit kind of the normal standard meters that we're used to. It's got that quality of, it'll get stuck in your head if you sing it a few times. So, my recommendation is pick at least one of the psalms that we've looked over today, or go through some of the other psalms of Ascents. We've only looked at 3 out of the 15. Look through those psalms and see what kinds of sentiments you find expressed there. The kind of expectation that is built up around the worship assembly, the kind of joy that's built up around it, this love of Christian fellowship. And as we've seen, even laments about how we don't yet have that eternal home with God. Again, all kinds of rich things that we can learn from the Psalms of Ascents to prepare our minds for entering into the worship assembly. And that's it for our study this week. I hope our study has been edifying to you. It's been my goal today to give us just kind of a broad picture of what it can look like to move from daily life into the worship assembly, instead of just trying to kind of flip the switch, as it were. And to give us some suggestions for things that we can be thinking about, things that we can be singing and praying about based on the Psalms of Ascents. The call this week is to see the worship assembly as a sanctuary, to see it as a special joy. If you're in a place right now where the worship assembly still has to be suspended, pray for the worship assembly to be restored. It's something that we should desire. And for those of us, we have been blessed here at 14th to be able to meet together, but of course it is abbreviated. It's not the fullness of what we are used to out of our worship assemblies. And it's entirely appropriate for us to pray for a return to that fullness that we are used to, because the worship assembly is such a blessing to us that these are the kinds of feelings that we ought to have about it. We ought to see it, again, as a special joy. If the virus, I think, if it's done nothing else, I hope that it has helped us to appreciate the assembly. If you are listening to this recording and you have not followed Jesus Christ, we want to extend the hope of the gospel to you. This hope that we participate in each week as we anticipate the worship assembly. Again, the worship assembly is pointing forward to something bigger. It's pointing forward to an eternal home with God. It's pointing to fellowship in the very broadest sense. Right? Again, this virus has, I hope, given us an appreciation for not just the worship assembly, but also for our friends and our loved ones and the time that we have with them, because it can be limited, right? We can be stuck not being able to enjoy that fellowship. So I hope we come to appreciate it. And the gospel points us forward to the greatest fellowship, the greatest community possible. What we sometimes call the communion of saints, where we have unity and we have fellowship with one another in the congregation, with all Christians the world over, in fact, with all Christians who have ever lived and who ever shall live. We share this fellowship with them at all times. We have fellowship, communion, with the saints that have gone on to be with the Lord. And I hope that, and these Psalms help us to appreciate that, but that mainly if you are not a follower of Jesus Christ, that you seek that out. because that fellowship is there. It is waiting and available for you if you will follow Jesus, the Son of God. So we invite you to repent of your sins, to confess Jesus as Lord, and to be baptized into his death, burial, and resurrection for the remission of your sins. Be added to the Lord's church so that you can enjoy this fellowship and have this kind of longing and anticipation in yourself. Wherever you're at, we encourage you to find a Church of Christ near you, to study the gospel with them, and enter into this process. If you are in the St. Petersburg, Florida area, we invite you to get in contact with us, the 14th Avenue Church of Christ. And again, we would love to study the gospel of Jesus with you and send you on that way to faithfulness and to belonging that the gospel promises. So, all that being done, we want to thank you for your time today. We look forward to meeting with you again next week, and until then, we pray that you take care. Bye-bye.